on behalf of the Knowledge Forum and Climate Analytics, I would like to welcome here at this webinar, which is about Pakistan's energy mix, rethinking Pakistan's energy mix. We are hoping that more people would be joining us as time goes, but we would really like to start on time. So I'll just jump into the details and the program agenda right now. So firstly, I would like to briefly introduce the two organizations that are behind today's convening. The Knowledge Forum is a Karachi-based think tank that works on producing knowledge-based I'll start my video. Yeah, hi everybody. So yes, I was talking about the Knowledge Forum, which is a Karachi-based think tank that works on producing knowledge-based resources on human rights and development. We try to focus on our work on community interest and well-being and make an effort to have community's voice represented in our work. Climate Analytics is a global organization that works on delivering cutting-edge science analysis and support to accelerate climate action and keep warming below 1.5 degrees C. CA is motivated by the desire to empower those most vulnerable, especially small island and developing states, to use the best science and analysis available in the international climate negotiations, as well as developing policies and institutional capacity to adapt to climate change. The reason we two have come together today is because of our shared interest in climate change and the role of fossil fuels in aggravating it. Fossil fuels, as we all know, coal, gas, and oil are by far the largest contributor to climate change, accounting for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and 90% of carbon dioxide emissions. With the intense heating of our planet, the biggest question that all of us are faced with is how to address the source of this greenhouse gas emissions, especially since it has become such an intrinsic driver of our human activity, economies, and development. While there's global consensus on phasing out coal, because of its carbon emissions property, gas is still being projected as clean and something that is a bridging fuel. The recent deepening of the climate crisis, especially in countries like Pakistan, while highlighting our vulnerabilities, also compels that we have a rethink on consumption practices that lie at the root of the global emissions. Fossil fuel particularly features high on this agenda. If I could give an example of Pakistan, oil and gas composes 3/4 portion of our energy mix. Natural gas composes 1/3 of electric power generation. Even when Pakistan is facing a depleting natural gas reserves, it is still going towards pursuing LNG, which is expensive and volatile, to replace CNG. There are weak regulations around carbon emissions, which is again resulting in further heating of our land. But there is also no regulation on addressing methane emissions. Pakistan is the seventh largest methane emitter in the world. And when we all know that methane is the most potent greenhouse gas, which is heating the planet. So today's webinar is aimed at creating a ground for a discourse that pushes for a rethink of fossil fuel. We are very clear about it, particularly gas in the energy mix. The basis of our argument is a 2021 report by Climate Analytics. The report is titled as Why Gas is the New Coal. The report critically examines key arguments that have been deployed in favor of the expansion of natural gas as a bridging fuel for a zero carbon future. The report examines the environmental, economic, social impact of a shift towards natural gas, and taking into account methane emissions, infrastructure requirements, investment costs, and energy security considerations. The analysis shows the role of natural gas as a bridging fuel has been vastly overstated, and its curtailment and phase out is needed to be sped up at the same pace, or maybe a little slower, similar to coal. But the thing is, it has to be done. So if I could briefly share today's program outline with you. Today, we have brought together experts who are behind this report, who have authored this report, but also who have a background in climate science, sustainable development, and climate policy. And of course, I mean, we have all the senior experts here with us to not only talk about this report, but also talk about a roadmap to phasing out fossil fuel in countries like Pakistan. The program agenda that would follow today's webinar. Firstly, we are going to have a presentation on this report, the report titled "Why Gas is the New Coal" by Dr. Victor Maxwell, who is an energy and policy analyst at Climate Analytics. Then we are going to have a panel discussion, 30 minutes long panel discussion, which will have participation of Mr. Bill Hare from Climate Analytics. He's the CEO of Climate Analytics, Dr. Fahad Saeed, who is a climate scientist and regional lead of Climate Analytics, Mr. Kashif Salik, who is a research fellow with Sustainable Policy Development Institute from Pakistan, and Mr. Muhammed Abdul Rafay, who is with Alternative Law Collective. I'm also going to highlight the Q&A process. So we have a Q&A chat box. You are requested to post your question on the chat box, and we are all noting those questions, and we'll try our best to devote as much time to the questions that are going to be shared with us. We will have 10 minutes dedicated to Q&A session after the panel discussion. So with this, I'm going to start the today's proceeding. I would invite Dr. Victor Maxwell to please share his presentation on the study. And one of the important things that I forgot to highlight, which is very important, is that today's webinar is going to be about Pakistan aspect of the report. So we have done a little two-pager, which will be shared. Climate Analytics has done that, which will be shared with you. But also Dr. Victor's presentation will also carry, some guidance towards how countries like Pakistan can go towards fossil fuel phase out. So over to you, Dr. Victor Maxwell.
Yeah, thank you, Zeenia. Give me a moment, I'll share my screen. There you go. Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, okay, so, today we are having this webinar about the path to climate action, rethinking fossil fuels in Pakistan energy mix. What I want to do is kind of provide some context for that discussion, right? Presenting some facts and figures, and hopefully that will help to facilitate the discussion that will come afterwards. The first thing that I kind of want to do is show a bit of a snapshot of the country. Pakistan is the fifth most populous country in the world, 18th largest greenhouse gas emitter. The country is continuing to face some kind of developmental issues. For example, 1 in 4 Pakistanis lack access to electricity. At the same time, the country is one of the top 10 most at risk for climate from climate change. And as you are well aware of the flooding that occurred last year, which led to more than 1,700 deaths and an estimated amount of economic losses equivalent to around 10% of the country's GDP. What you can see here in the figure is a comparison of Pakistan with countries that have a similar CO2 emissions per capita. And it's showing the GDP per capita of these countries. You can see that Pakistan is at the lower end of the range, which kind of indicates that even though there's been increased use of fossil fuels and therefore increased emissions, this is not necessarily translated into the economic and developmental benefits. So let's taking a look now at the primary energy supply for the country. Fossil fuels account for around 87% of Pakistan's primary energy supply. Recently, there's been a switch from oil to coal and from domestic natural gas to imported LNG. Fossil fuel imports account for around 40% of primary energy supplies. That's pretty high. Non-hydro renewables account for around 1% of primary energy supply. In recent years, the country has met a growing energy demand mostly through increased domestic coal production and importing LNG. Domestic coal production has increased from 3.3 megatons in 2015 to 8.8 megatons in 2020. If we look at the power sector, fossil fuels account for around 60% of Pakistan's electricity generation. Hydro accounts for 23% of electricity, other non-hydro renewables, 4%. Here, the switch from oil to coal and from domestic gas to LNG is even more striking than when in primary energy. At the same time as this has happened, the country's targets, as through their NDC and more recent targets, suggest that the government is seeking to expand renewable electricity to 60% in terms of capacity by 2030, an additional 14,000 megawatts of wind and solar within the next 10 years. So there's a contrast here between the transition that we've seen in the past few years, which has been one of replacing oil with coal and domestic gas with LNG, to the transition that is being indicated by these targets, which would be from fossil fuels towards renewables. If we look at the recent generation capacity expansion plan by the National Transmission and Dispatch Company, what are they saying about what will happen by 2030, 2031? Fossil fuels, which currently account for around 64% of Pakistan's generation capacity, that capacity share is expected to decrease by around 14%. Hydro capacity is expected to double. Solar PV capacity is expected to increase tenfold. In total amount of capacity is expected to increase by around 75%. And there's going to be a drop in the amount of imported fossil fuels for power generation. Okay, so now let's take a look at emissions. For Pakistan, agriculture accounts for around 42% of emissions. That's mostly methane. Energy sector accounts for 47% of emissions. That's mostly CO2. In 2017, the total emissions in the country, excluding LULUCF, have been estimated to be around 455 megatons of CO2e. Yeah. So now we can take a look at what might happen in the future in terms of emissions. The NDC, the government put out in 2021, has two targets for emissions: an unconditional target of a 15% emissions reduction below 2030 forecast BAU levels, including LULUCF, and a conditional target, which would be an additional 35% reduction below those 2030 BAU levels. What does the government project to be those 2030 BAU levels? Well, they're actually quite high. 1,603 megatons of CO2e, including LULUCF. If you exclude the estimated LULUCF, that would be around 1,574 megatons of CO2e. So at best, if you take into account the NDC targets, conditional and unconditional, we would see emissions of 787 megatons of CO2e, excluding LULUCF, by 2030. That's an 89% increase from 2015 levels. When we analyze the 1.5 compatible scenarios, it shows that Pakistan reducing emissions by 26 to 46% below 2015 levels by 2030, and 60 to 67% below 2015 levels by 2050. So there's a big ambition gap between what is targeted in the NDC and what would be compatible with a 1.5 global trajectory. And that ambition gap is something like 524 megatons of CO2e. So that's even greater than the total emissions, annual emissions currently. So if we look at the power sector again, as we've said, Pakistan has a plan to increase the capacity share of renewables, wind, solar, biomass, and small hydro by 30%, and large-scale hydro by another 30% by 2030. In terms of generation, if we look at what it would be 1.5 compatible, renewables will contribute something like 76 to 81% of power generation by 2030, 95 to 100% by 2050. Coal-fired power generation will be phased out by 2029. Gas-fired power generation phased out between 2038 and 2045. And generally, the power sector decarbonization around 2038. Decarbonization offers a lot of opportunities and developmental benefits. Job growth from renewables could outweigh job losses from closed coal power plants by 2.8 to 1, factor of 2.8 to 1, we estimate. With an accelerated coal phase out, Pakistan could substantially reduce the estimated number of premature deaths from air pollution. And renewables being the lowest cost source of power generation could play a role in easing the burden of circular debt. Okay, so now let's compare those 1.5 compatible scenarios with what is being forecast under the indicative generation capacity expansion plan that we saw earlier. So that plan sees an average of 62% renewable share in power capacity by 2031, while the 1.5 scenarios forecast an average of 70% renewable capacity share in 2030. So that indicative generation capacity expansion plan is almost there in terms of 1.5 compatibility. However, if we look at what's happening on the ground, is it showing that we're on a good path towards meeting those targets of the plan, of the indicative generation capacity plan? So what we can see is that in terms of gas capacity, the current amount of capacity in operation exceeds what the target is for 2031. So that would have to be reduced. Coal in the pipeline, if you add the coal in the pipeline to what's currently in operation, that would also exceed the target. So that would have to be reduced. Hydro capacity in development would far exceed the target set forth in that IGCEP. However, solar and wind are lagging behind. Even though in development solar capacity would increase the total amount of solar capacity fivefold, this would still be less than half of what is being targeted by 2030. Okay. So now to just briefly discuss some of the power sector issues, and specifically the issue of circular debt. Circular debt, as you are aware, is essentially the net unfunded outstanding liability position of the power distribution companies to the Power Purchasing Authority, which in turns leads to delayed payment to the power generation companies and triggers borrowing by those companies. If you look at how circular debt has kind of played out in the past few years, it's been increasing in terms of equivalent to GDP, share of GDP. It's gone from something like 2% to something like 6%. So it's an ongoing and increasing problem. Some of the factors that contribute to circular debt are the high cost of power generation, the inability of the distribution companies to collect the fees for the power generated from their customers, a delay in adjusting the tariffs for power to, meet the cost, the actual cost of generating power. And because there's this disagreement between the tariff and the cost, the government is attempting to subsidize that differential, but that subsidy is unfunded. Another issue is the high transmission and distribution losses. So this is an issue with inefficiency in the system. As you can see in this other figure, power transmission and distribution losses in Pakistan are way above what is we see as a world average. So now I kind of want to talk about this report.
We have 2 more minutes to go, please.
Sorry?
Just giving a heads up, we have 2 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll go through this briefly. This report, Why Gas is the New Coal, which was already kind of introduced, is 2 of the key findings that natural gas is the largest source of fossil CO2 emissions increase in the last decade, 2010 to 2019, responsible for around 60% of methane emissions and 70% of the projected increase in fossil CO2 emissions under current policies to 2030. The use of unabated natural gas and primary energy supply should have already peaked and should be declining globally. And if we look, visualize this, actually for both gas and coal, this is from the report, in terms of, if we look at, these 1.5 compatible scenarios, at the global level, primary energy use of unabated coal and gas should peak very soon and begin a rapid decline, reaching about half of present levels by 2030 in the case of coal, and in the case of gas, having only 5 to 10 years after that. For electricity, unabated gas should peak around 2020, more than half between 2035 and 2040, and by this time, coal should be already phased out of the system. If we look at these same kind of trajectories, but now for Pakistan itself, which is a bit different than the global kind of picture because gas is much more prominent than coal for Pakistan. But again, we see this kind of phasing out of both coal and gas in Pakistan, coal earlier, Pakistan a bit later. For primary energy, you see a phase out for coal sometime in the 2040s, phase out for gas, 2050s. Power generation, the picture is a bit more certain. Again, a phase out 2040 for coal, gas by 2050. I believe that's my last slide. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand it back to you. Thanks. Sorry, could you unmute yourself?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. So thank you so much, Dr. Victor, for this very insightful and I think a precise presentation on not only about the report, but we also wanted to understand Pakistan's context in this whole debate. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. And I would again stress that Dr. Victor is not just the author of this, one of the authors of this report, but he's also a climate and energy policy and transition pathway expert focusing on oil and gas in Australia and Asia. So thank you. And we do have questions coming in, so we'll be turning back to you very soon. Thank you. I'll now mark the start of our panel discussion, which has our 4 esteemed panelists. I'll just briefly introduce the panelists and also share how we are going to go about it. So we have Dr. Bill Hare, Mr. Bill Hare, who is a physicist and climate scientist. He's the founder and CEO of Climate Analytics, which, as I shared earlier, works on advancing scientific knowledge on climate change. Mr. Bill regularly advises and presents science and policy assessment to ministers and heads of government from developing countries and vulnerable countries. We have Dr. Fahad Saeed, who is a Islamabad-based climate impact expert and regional lead at Climate Analytics. His expertise encompasses climate modeling, and associated risks and impacts. His researches have been featured in international publications, and he also works on policy briefs and reports. Then we also have Mr. Kashif Salik, who is from the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. He's an agriculture economist who works on research and project management. In the panel, we also have Mr. Abdul Rafay, who's from Alternative Law Collective, an organization that works on climate change and energy transition, among other things. Rafay's work focuses on land, gas, and environmental law. So thank you again, all our panelists, for joining us here. I am going to share the format of how we're going to go about it. So we have 1 to 2 questions from each of our panelists, which we are going to be putting out before them. And unfortunately, because of time limitations, we will be able to give 6 to 7 minutes to each of our panelists to respond to those questions so that our conversation can be advanced. And of course, there will be another set of questions at the end of the session that will be coming from the audience that will be shared with our panelists. So I'll start with you, Mr. Bill Hare. We have 2 questions for you. Firstly, coming from this report that covers a lot, of arguments related to Paris Agreement. Our first question would be that, do you think the Paris Agreement is enough to prevent global average temperature from rising 1.5 degrees Celsius? Do you agree? And also, what is the problem with it? Are the pledges not enough? Is the financial support not enough? Or is it that both are not adequate? The other question is that given the current pace of action and limited architecture on fossil fuel phase out at the global level, how realistic it is to expect developing countries like Pakistan that are so fossil fuel dependent to take action on this, given that there is inadequacy of financial and technical resources faced by countries like ours. So over to you, Mr. Bill Hare. I hope I've been articulated enough in explaining the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Zeenia, and thanks for taking the initiative to set this up. Look, I'll answer the questions briefly because I'm interested also to hear from the audience as well. But on the first question, is the Paris Agreement enough? Well, in principle, yes. If countries in good faith came forward with enough ambition and enough climate finance, then the Paris Agreement provides a globally fair framework to actually limit warming below 1.5 degrees. From the science side, we know that this is still possible, but we also know that we've got a massive job ahead of us to halve emissions globally by 2030 and provide the financial support to do so. And if we're thinking in particular about the situation of Pakistan, one thing I have to say is that, even if we're successful at limiting warming to 1.5 degrees, there's going to be an awful lot of damage and an awful lot of risk to Pakistan and indeed other countries in South Asia. And I know Fahad will probably talk about that. And that means that we have to have not just finances for mitigation, but also for adaptation and for loss and damage. And I'm not going to talk too much about adaptation, loss and damage now, but I just wanted to emphasize that. Now, how realistic is it to expect Pakistan to be able to move away from a carbon-intensive future? There's a complex answer to that. Pakistan has a lot of opportunities. We saw the economic numbers at the beginning on GDP and so on, but we also know that Pakistan has a lot of capacity in renewable energy potentially, a lot of wind, a lot of solar, has a large potential workforce as well to deploy these technologies, and it has a lot of benefits that it would gain from avoiding and reducing fossil fuel imports. Reducing those imports would liberate, in principle anyway, economic resources for the development of people and overcoming, indeed, the very severe levels of energy access and energy poverty in Pakistan. As Victor pointed out, fossil fuel dependence doesn't lead to necessarily reduced levels of energy poverty. In fact, there's often a correlation there. So having said that, Pakistan has opportunities. It needs to work on a more comprehensive and better enabling framework. And many of the technologies are cost effective, but a country in Pakistan's situation can't achieve the scale of the rollout of renewable energy technologies without international financial support. Capital scarcity is an issue in Pakistan. So it's not just a matter of whether technologies are cheaper. It needs support, and that's true of so many countries in Pakistan's position globally. So bottom line is, to finish, the architecture of the Paris Agreement can work. And for countries like Pakistan, it can only really work if Pakistan sets up the enabling framework, but the international community then delivers the scale of financial resources in different ways to enable Pakistan to invest in these technologies. So I think that's how I'd answer the questions initially, and I'll hand back to you, Zeenia, for other panelists and then audience questions.
Thank you very much. I think you rightly pointed out the task ahead of us and the way forward. And this is well noted that, higher fossil fuel consumption doesn't exactly lead to development. I would now turn to Dr. Fahad Saeed. And given your background on climate impact, perhaps you can highlight the impact side of the problem that we are currently facing. So the first question that we have for you is, given that we already are experiencing 1.1 degrees C of climate warming, what can we expect even if we limit global warming to the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees C? It's a bit of a technical question, but we really need to understand, what it would be like as we go forward. And given that we are currently heading to 2.7 degrees C actually, how would you assess the level of preparedness for developing countries like Pakistan? I'll put out the next question also so that you could answer them together. So this is very Pakistan-specific problem. We all know that climate change is not country-specific, nor its response can be. So given the current given the interconnected geographies of South Asia, yet very strong conflict undercurrents in our region, what do you think is the path to building resilience at the regional level? So over to you, Dr. Fahad Saeed.
Thank you very much, Zeenia, for first of all inviting me, and I would also like to thank Victor and Bill for their very useful presentation and comments respectively. So to answer your question, so as you said that currently we are around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees centigrade warming, and at this level of warming, Pakistan is facing unprecedented impacts of climate change. So in one of his slides, Victor showed that the last year's flooding incurred damages of around $30 billion to Pakistan's overall economy. But let me put these numbers into a bit more of context. So Pakistan total exports are also $30 billion per year. So having faced overall damages of $30 billion means that we have compromised on our exports just because of one climatic event. And let me also tell you that we have been a part of a study which is the new field of science called climate change attribution study, and we have shown that climate change has a significant role to play in exacerbating that particular flooding event of last year. On top of that, we are not including the damages which were incurred by the heat wave, the unprecedented record-breaking heat wave Pakistan and northwestern India received last year. During that heat wave, we also incurred a lot of damages, including the damage to the wheat crop, to livestock, to forest fire, to blow-off event, damaging infrastructure. So if you bring that extreme also into equation, so the damages would go far beyond $30 billion. So it means that the overall export, the annual export of the country are compromised because of just two couple of events, which are both attributed to climate change. This brings me to the fact that we are currently 1.1 degrees centigrade warmer, and you can imagine that these impacts are going to increase with every 10th of a degree of global warming. So at 1.5 degrees centigrade, these results would be even more intense. Anything beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade would simply means death sentence for a lot of vulnerable population of Pakistan. They might not be able to cope, especially those which are associated with agriculture or other such vulnerable sectors. So it is very important for Pakistan to address the issue of climate change at the global level. Having said that, I would say that unfortunately climate change doesn't come at the top of political agendas for a country like Pakistan. There are other issues like health, education, food security and others. That's why there is not a lot of understanding or awareness regarding these aspects. But in order to, when we talk about climate, about Paris Agreement, then I would say that the limit of 1.5 degrees centigrade, anything beyond that limit would be very difficult for Pakistan to cope. This brings me to the second question where you asked about the possible cooperation between the South Asian countries. I would say that climate change knows no boundaries. We understand that there have been a better relationship. The history has been volatile between the countries of South Asia, especially when you compare the western part of South Asia between Pakistan and India. They share the same culture, but at the same time they share the same climate. Because I refer to a climate extreme event last year of heat wave. Both Pakistan and India suffered almost at the same level by that particular heat wave. So it is very important for both the countries to start collaborating, because by sharing knowledge, by sharing technologies, and one of the example is the adoption of the heat plan, which was introduced in one of the city of India called Ahmedabad, and Pakistan also developed the heat plan. If you compare both the heat plans of Karachi heat plan and Ahmedabad heat plan, they actually are there. There are a lot of commonalities between the two. So it means that there is a big opportunity to collaborate between the two countries, not only between the two countries, but also all the countries of South Asia. Unfortunately, there have been a couple of avenues. One of them is SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, but that body is not functional at the moment. But I think we can revoke that particular, that body to cooperate more on climate change. And there's a lot of opportunity to learn from each other. We have the same impacts of climate change. We have retreating glaciers, we have flooding, we have heat. And the countries have been, the people in the country have been, facing such heat even for the last 5,000 years. But now, because of climate change, it's just going beyond their limits to adaptation. So I think that these are the climate change can also be an opportunity for the countries of South Asia to come closer, not only when we talk about climate change, but also beyond that, when it comes to regional cooperation, economic cooperation, etc.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I think it was very well noted that given our experiences and challenges are the same at the regional level, the structures of action and cooperation have to be reimagined and certainly restarted. I would now turn to Mr. Kashif Salik, and given your background and understanding of the micro level issues, Fahad has drawn a very good picture of how things have been emerging at macro level, regional level. We would like to understand, what do you think is the social cost that countries like Pakistan have to pay for their blind pursuit of fossil fuels, particularly from imported sources? So if you could help us, walk through how it looks like at the micro level. Over to you, to Kashif Salik.
Thank you, Zeenia, for inviting me and also giving me the opportunity to talk in your seminar. And of course, Victor has presented a macro level picture about the electricity production high cost, and also Bill has talked about loss and damages, and Fahad has also talked about the macro level impacts. So I will talk about little bit about the people, because in 2022, when the flood was in Pakistan, I traveled across Pakistan in all 4 provinces and try to understand the vulnerabilities after the floods. And we went there after 6 months, and you know that they are still striving for their food and energy. And mostly those people are living in tents and living in roadsides, and they have no schools, no education for children, and also no diet for, or no food actually. So when and in some places, of course, when people are settled down in their areas, they are facing with the infrastructure loss, particularly the power sector. So they think facing the power crisis. So living in a monsoon time period, when the heat waves are high, when the flood is coming, people with high energy costs, they always have a problem with these things, because you know that in Pakistan, most of the income is spent on the food, about 60% or more. And then recent studies has shown that this energy cost, the powers, the bills cost has even increased their consumer price index. So they have increased substantially. So the power, the bills, the electricity bills is beyond the reach of the poor, especially in the rural areas compared to the urban areas. And it is mostly happened that the subsidies that are provided in the power sector is mostly in favor of the commercial or industrial purposes. So the most vulnerable and most people who are the most vulnerable are the poor. So those people who are having a problem of loss and damages because of their houses are not there, their agriculture is greatly lost because of the tractors, and their all farm implements is displaced. The animals are no more there. So within that space, with every year with climate extremes like heat waves and floods, they face financial losses, and that gradual and also the abrupt losses of financial losses actually reduces their capacity to adapt. Why I'm saying that? Because currently I'm working with the government about the precision agriculture, which has a huge potential to mitigate at least the methane emissions, which you have earlier mentioned that Pakistan is the 7th largest methane emission. So with the precision agriculture technologies, just like drones and just like decision support system for precise application of fertilizers and pesticides that reduce the emissions. So that applications have some cost. So what you think or imagine that with that cost, does these poor farmers in rural areas, does they able to adapt these type of precision agricultural technologies? So I am pretty sure that they are not. So similarly with that mitigation, so if they are not adopting the advanced technologies that are going to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, I think the targets to reduce methane in agriculture sector, it is a distant dream, I think so. Then moving to the other side, the energy and infrastructure loss. I have seen that over the past 6 months, then the flood has gone. The people are still facing consistent supply of energy. So these climatic and non-climatic events, because the energy cost has increased over the years, substantially increased over the years. So that how to mitigate, and incomes have reduced because of the inflation and all this. So the gap has increased actually, particularly in rural areas. And now with the depreciation of rupee, this is also witnessed in the urban areas. So with these scenarios, how Pakistan has very beautiful plans for renewable energies and all these stuff, but how they develop the infrastructure for renewable energy, particularly as the government has just reduced the tax or abolished the tax on solar panels, but how it is really impacted the communities still need to be considered. So my point is here, first is to do more research and development, because still research is not available that, of course, if we go for a zero carbon or zero transition of industry or energy sector, how it will impact the consumer at the urban areas, particularly in the rural areas, who will get the benefit in the urban, because the social disparity is there in the rural areas. The land holding and landless farmers, about 60% of the population in rural areas are landless people. How they will they will get impacted from this zero transition or greenhouse gas reductions. So that need to be understand that who will get the benefit and who will get less benefit or loss during this transition of zero carbon transitions. So there is also need to build a more awareness for more in terms of renewable energy, in terms of particularly the solar panels, reducing the cost and all these stuff. And also, of course, the important thing under Paris Agreement, we need some international technology transfer. So we need have a very sound international partnership regarding this. So I've stopped here, and then I will respond to the questions by the participant. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that you very well pointed out how the experience looks like for common citizens, and particularly because Pakistan has a very important context of perpetual economic instability, unfortunately, that keeps landing us into what we call poly-crisis every few, I would say years. So thank you, and we'll come back to you. So I'll now go to Rafay. Rafay, given your policy background on policy and legislation, and all the points that have been pointed out by our earlier panelists, what do you think that acts as impediments to fossil fuel phase out in Pakistan, particularly gas phase out? Do you think there's any policy level thinking happening, work happening, and is there a way out of it? At least, in terms of policy and legislation landscape. Over to you.
Thank you, Zeenia. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Zeenia, for this great question. And thank you to my fellow panelists for sharing the findings of their important studies. I would like to address your question by flagging a range of factors that I think are the main roadblocks behind gas phase out in Pakistan. There are several obstacles that hinder the phase out of gas in our country, both on a global scale and domestically. First and foremost, I think the role of financial institution is important to flag here. For instance, Pakistan's natural gas production peaked in 2012, which should have prompted the country to consider a gas phase-out strategy. However, due to pressure from entities like the IMF and other financial institutions like ADB, Pakistan was pushed to secure LNG deals to fill the energy gap and ensure energy security. As a result, the country entered into a long-term contracts with Qatar, like 15-year long contract with Qatar, and it also constructed LNG terminals and plans to build more. Even the LNG policy was also enacted, which envisions various streams of procurement, encourages private participation, and introduces new rules with respect to market competition. That said, another significant factor is the lack of international commitment to gas phase out. Only a few countries have pledged to halt gas production and exploration so far. And that commitment is also flawed. Like even the USA, where offshore activities were restricted for a while, onshore gas work continued at a rapid pace. So here it is important to understand that like managing the demand side and supply side is important. What does this mean is that these countries should impose a ban not only on the new gas fields, on the exploration of new gas fields, and as well as think about like reducing the demand side as well. Some countries like China have pledged to stop financing coal projects overseas, but that alone is not sufficient. Pakistan requires substantial funding to transition from gas to cleaner alternatives in a just and equitable manner. Unless the funding is secured, weaning the country off from this is quite impossible. These were the global factors, and now there are some domestic impediments that I would like to mention here. The first of them is the presence of extensive gas infrastructural network, which makes it easier to rely on gas. Shifting away from gas would require massive infrastructural changes, which again means a huge funding and huge financing. Currently, about 28% of the energy in the national system comes from gas and RLNG. Additionally, various sectors such as domestic, industrial, commercial, fertilizer are also heavily reliant on gas, not to mention the vast network of CNG stations. The extensive pipeline network, including the upcoming and future pipelines, the contracts that the country is planning to execute with Russia, Iran, and Turkmenistan, show no signs of retirement. Although the state has the power to phase out gas, the current will of the state is not there. I mean, without climate funding for gas phase out and the differentiated timelines given to developing countries, the state can still, do some things. For example, it can impose moratorium on new gas fields, and it can stop the expansion of pipeline network. It is ironic that IGCEP thinks and minimizes the role of RLNG and gas in the upcoming years. But on the other hand, the political side is thinking about securing more gas pipelines. So there is that. Another important domestic impediment is the political nature that I just referred. For example, important decisions regarding system expansion, contract, and subsidies are decided by the federal government. For example, I would like to mention here a vast differential between the weighted average cost of gas and the price applied to the domestic sector. So OGRA, the basket price of gas for 2023, both for gas and RLNG was decided to be about 3,000 rupees and some rupees. But when these prices were notified by the Federation, there was a vast difference between the basket price and the prices notified. So for example, for the domestic sector, it was decided to be around 120 rupees per MMBTU for tandoors and stoves like commercial activity. It was decided to be around 110 rupees. For the fertilizer, it was 500 rupees. So you can see how much subsidies is given in gas sector, and then it causes the rising circular debt. Lastly, there is also environmental regulatory frameworks that also promote the gas sector. For example, in the upstream activities, the regulator does not require an EIA. And also in the midstream and downstream operations. Similarly, it was mentioned earlier that there are no regulations with respect to methane. And there is, and that's why a large amount of gas is lost in the form of methane, and no one puts or imposes fines or bans on these public utilities. So these are some of the factors that I think are the main impediments behind gas phase out. Apologies, there was an internet connection issue, so I have had to switch off my video.
Thank you so much. I think it was important to hear your voice, and thank you, Rafay. I think it's very important to highlight that the whole environment, finance, economic infrastructure that comes together to promote fossil fuel and gas. And that is where, action needs to happen. That is what needs to be targeted if any roadmap towards phasing out has to be undertaken. So thank you, Rafay, and we hope to come back to you in our question and answer session, which we are going to begin now. So we have a bunch of questions for almost all our speakers, and not too much time left. So I'm just going to spell out the questions for our speakers, and maybe if they can reply to them in one go rather than answering them separately. So we have a few questions starting with Bill. Bill, I'll just be quickly summarizing them here so that you could answer them. So one of the questions is about a way out for countries like Pakistan, which are now, in order to meet their energy needs, are now becoming more and more energy import dependent. So that is another problem that is coming up in Pakistan's context. So please think about a way out. The other question is, which is something that we also keep facing, that developed countries keep turning to high fossil fuel use for their own energy demands. And here UK cited as one of the leading coal energy consumer. So, I mean, something about like how like that can be navigated. There was another very specific question about net zero and its highly problematic language and approach. So these are three questions for you, Bill. Over to you.
Thanks, Zeenia. Look, I'll try and answer those quickly. So energy import to developing countries, this is also a really big theme. I mentioned that earlier, if I understood the question correctly. And that comes through countries trying to solve problems in a short-term way because of lack of capital. We did a study for Africa, which showed actually a lot of African countries have massive renewables, but don't have the money to actually invest. And so they're forced to import fossil fuels. So this gets back to the enabling framework and support from the international community. And without that, I doubt whether the problem can be solved, really. That's why it's so critical. Now, some developed countries, United Kingdom, still using coal. Actually, the UK is reducing coal quickly. But what's going on in the UK is a move back to drilling for oil and gas, which is really bad. And there's a bit of an uproar in the UK about that. But that's the story of politics. Politics goes backwards and forwards, I'm afraid, and not just in Pakistan and not just in Australia, but in other places as well. So I think that's something we just have to ride through and hope that through the pressure from civil society and those all concerned about the problem, that we can push countries, their political system, to actually maintain their focus. We do have an uneven progress around the world on climate change. There's no doubt about it. And that's one of the big risks that we face. The last issue on net zero. Yeah, look, this is a really complex question. And from the science point of view, net zero is best thought of as a global rule. We need to have net zero because there are going to be emissions that we can't get rid of easily or at all. Agriculture being a notable sector, maybe a few others. And so there has to be negative emissions from somewhere else, carbon dioxide storage, either technological or with in forests and soils. But that needs to be kept to an absolute minimum. And this can also be true in an individual country, that you've got to look at it from the point of view of what can a country do. So a country like Pakistan, with a very big agricultural base, probably won't be able to go to real zero, if I can put it that way. You'll need to have some negative CO2 emissions ultimately at some point in the next 3 or 4 decades. But the first things first, the real issue is to get emissions reduced and to start that pathway of transition. And in 20 or 30 years, then think about just how you actually get to net zero. In developed countries, we need to be thinking right now about that. But for countries in Pakistan's situation, it's a bit longer and further down the road, I think. Back to you, Zeenia.
Thank you. We are now going to move to Victor, who also has been asked a couple of important questions. And I think a lot of questions are now pointing towards the direction of how a phase out can be realized. So, Victor, there's one question about possible alternatives to gas phase out in Pakistan, given the fact that the domestic sector and fertilizer industry are significant consumers of gas in Pakistan. And these are very important industries. There's also another very important, interesting question about why we cannot plan to produce green hydrogen, especially for industry, as more or less we can utilize existing gas networks. That is also something that is, under a lot of debate. So these are two questions for you, Victor.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, okay, so concerning the gas phase out and the industries that are really using gas fertilizer, I think what has been mentioned by others is that the problem really is not of technical barriers, but institutional barriers. And so, with production of fertilizer, the technology is there for green ammonia. Yeah, so you could produce non-fossil fuel-based fertilizer. And in Pakistan, which studies have shown that there is a massive amount of potential for renewables, solar and wind. Speaking of not hydro, but solar and wind. There is the potential to ramp up electricity generation so that it could cover not only what is now being used, what is now electrified, but other industries as well. So again, it's not so much of a problem of technical barriers, but institutional barriers, the financing, the political will, and the solutions to that. I think others have discussed to get the global community on board for financing and to put pressure on governments. I'm sorry, your other question was about hydrogen. Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Yes, this was about green hydrogen, which is projected as an alternative to gas. So the question was that why can we not plan to produce green hydrogen, especially for industry, if you're talking about, alternatives to gas? And
Yeah,
also,
okay.
strategy of CCUS is being considered. I'm not sure what CCUS is, but if you'd like to answer that.
Yeah, okay. So the issue with hydrogen is one of where it should be used. There is some industries that could be fairly easily electrified. If we talk about it in terms of the technical feasibility, and there's some other industries or sectors where electrification is less feasible, and for that you would need something to replace that is still green or clean, and there would be a role for hydrogen there. Or ammonia. So this is the example of green ammonia for fertilizer, right? But it has to be very clear about where that hydrogen is going to be used, and also how that hydrogen is going to be produced. Going down a path of fossil fuel-based hydrogen is a very dangerous one for emissions and for locking in emissions. They're locking in the infrastructure, the fossil fuel infrastructure. And I think we discussed this problem at length in the white gas is the new coal, at least at the global level. Things like CCUS are an unproven technology for abatement or for keeping keeping emissions down. And so again, if you look for a technical feasibility, doing something like electrifying, producing green fuels like ammonia is more technically feasible, has been proven, whereas something like actually sequestering carbon, capturing and sequestering carbon for the amount of time that would have to be sequestered has not been proven. So I would not recommend CCUS as a viable alternative in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe we'll have time for two more questions. One is specifically for Bill again. And there's another one that is related to climate analytics work. So Bill, just a quick question. This point about environment, social and governance compliance. And if you can advise if the current pace of ESG compliance is satisfactory, and what body would certify private sector as being compliant? And would that body be an existing regulator with expanded scope to ensure compliance, or certain third-party independent evaluators?
Well, thanks, Zeenia. That actually is a very interesting and complicated question. The short answer is ESG compliance and reporting working? I think the general view now is it's generally not working. Why is it not working? Because there often isn't third-party standards or legislated standards by which companies need to report on ESG. So in a sense, you have, if I can use a horrible American term, you have that Wild West approach now where many are choosing their own auditors and so on. There is a movement towards legislative management of ESG claims. So we're seeing in the European Union and other countries moves to actually regulate how ESG is done and to develop common government-managed standards and auditing of that. And I think that's probably going to be the future, and more countries are joining that. And I think that's something to look at. The first priority is going to be with the very big companies. I think regulators are focused on the very big companies, the big multinational companies, and prioritizing smaller companies in developing countries way down the line. So that's something to watch out for. It's very, very important. And there's quite a movement to do that. I was on the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero last year. It was a big theme. Now, look, if you don't mind, I'll just jump also in on the hydrogen issue as well, because, and it's a question back for discussion in Pakistan, actually, because if you look at the numbers, Pakistan has a lot of the resources needed to make a lot of green hydrogen, and hence green ammonia. It has hydro, it has massive wind, it has a lot of sunlight and so on. And the question is, why is this not possible? And there's certainly many use cases in Pakistan, including cement and so on, where you could replace fossil fuel with heat from hydrogen and so on, or part of the fertilizer process that Victor's mentioned, where you make green ammonia. So it looks to me like a social political problem of how would you encourage the investment at scale in the renewable energy system and the companies that would be able to build the electrolyzers and deliver it to the companies and places that need it. So this is a discussion, I think, in Pakistan about how you would enable that. And it's not an unconstructive discussion. There's lots of big hydrogen projects being developed in the developing world now, where those discussions are happening with governments, whether it's Namibia or Mauritania or Morocco in Africa or in Egypt. So they're discussions that can lead to real benefit to people on the ground.
Thank you. In fact, if at the cost of dragging it, there was also a question about hydropower and this being used as a form of renewable energy. So unlike other VREs, hydro involves emissions of methane and other forms of ecological degradation. So do you think Pakistan's preference to add large hydropower project as a plan to transition away from dirty fossil fuel, does that make sense? Maybe Bill, you could answer it, or Victor, whoever would like to. There's a lot of debate going on about it in Pakistan.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And I think the answers to hydropower are both at one level, at a global level, like how many emissions do you get from it? The other level is, does it meet your sustainability requirements? Is it as good as hydro developers claim? You know, I mean, in the Himalayan region where much of your hydro comes from, there's a lot of history of projects really not working for different reasons. There can be just the extreme conditions at high altitude. There can be extreme flooding and so on that break hydro plant. I know India in particular has got a long list of projects that have basically catastrophically failed. So I think there just needs to be a proper risk assessment. I mean, there is undoubtedly a large capacity, for sure, but it needs to be sustainable, and it needs to take care of people's livelihoods and so on the ground, not just the hydro developers. So that's something that is principally a national level discussion, I would say.
Absolutely. I think that's very rightly pointed out. I would now go to Fahad, Dr. Fahad. There's a long question about one of the studies that has been done by Climate Analytics. In the interest of time management, I will not read it out, but if you would like to answer that, please.
Yes, yeah, I've seen the question, and to answer that, yeah, again, it's a very good and a bit complicated question to answer. So whenever you're doing a study, you not only have to see that what kind of a question is being, who is asking that question. So in that study, the main motivation was to address the question that whether climate change had any role in exacerbating the impact of that particular event. And we saw, using state-of-the-art climate models, that climate change did have a role to exacerbate the impacts of climate change. But of course, the science is very clear. The Working Group 2, for example, IPCC Working Group 2 report, it has a framework of risk assessment, which besides hazard also takes into account the exposure and vulnerability to assess a particular hazard. And Pakistan is a classic case in that respect. We have seen that we had infrastructure being built on the waterways that we saw in 2010, and then we again have seen in 2022 that the hotels and the buildings which were constructed on the way of the river were destroyed, and they were, people living on the riverbed, where once the river used to flow, and if it doesn't flow for 5-6 years, people go and settle there. And there have been many issues of infrastructure which were been identified. So again, we have to look inwards and outwards when we talk about climate change. Inwards at what kind of policies we are developing, how good is the governance within the country, and how effective are the local, provincial, and the national government in addressing those issues, as well as outwards. When we talk about climate change, we need to tell the world that we are one of the worst affected countries in the world, and we need support, international support. And again, Bill and Victor also have very politely mentioned the issues of governance by saying it like framework, like institutional framework, and the policies which needs to be in place. And being a Pakistani, I would take the liberty to bring it up more strongly. We have also we have seen that issue of IPPs in the country. It's and the kind of capacity payments which we are paying to the IPCC at the moment, and people have seen those as a roadblock for development in the energy sector or the power sector itself. So these kind of governance issues we need to tackle from our own and within the country, and we need to make policies and the frameworks to attract foreign funding in renewables. Just as a last point, I'll take a couple of seconds to share an anecdote that it was around 2002, 2003. I invested some money in buying that camera, with the film and the roll which goes into it. And after 6 months, there was a new technology of digital cameras which were introduced in the market, and it made that investment obsolete because that became useless. The camera with the film, where we had to go to for the developers and spend money and everything. The technology has changed, And again, the point is that the renewable technology is coming up so fast into the market. IPCC report has said that the renewable technologies are becoming cheaper. So we again have to ask ourselves that is it a good time to invest in fossil fuel, considering that there have been such a big investment, innovation going on in renewable technologies, and Pakistan, which is blessed with a lot of renewable energy options. Should we be investing more in the renewables or we adopt the technologies of the fossil fuel? So that is the big question which needs to be answered, and that has to be answered by we as Pakistanis. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there's a lot to discuss, but we're already running over time. So sadly, we'll have to close this session. Our session may be coming to an end, but the conversation is certainly not. And we would continue to find ways to connecting climate science and impact assessment on our experiences of climate change and a way forward, which is what has brought us all together. Just to announce that we will be sharing the video of this session on YouTube, the Knowledge Forum's YouTube channel, as soon as possible. And there will also be a press release and other media products coming out of it. Lastly, I would really like to emphasize that our focus is on finding a way out of this fossil fuel and poor climate response capacity trap and giving a direction to Pakistan's policy discourse by emphasizing the use of climate science and evidence. So we really think that this is not the last conversation that we are having, first and last. We do really want to organize more such conversations and take it forward in the best way possible. I would like to thank Bill, Fahad, Kashif, Rafay, and above all Victor for their very, very insightful remarks as well as presentations. And our purpose was to bring into Pakistan's mainstream discourse this huge problematic impact of fossil fuel, especially gas, and how it can be, the direction can be changed. So we really hope that we have made a little bit of effort towards that direction and looking forward to more conversations. So thank you for your time, and thank you so much, the audience, for your wonderful questions and for your patience and for your very lively participation. So I'll close the session now. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.